and hopefully it won't fail. Okay, so we're talking about float-based layouts today. No? Like this. This is what I wanted to do. Okay, so we're going to talk about float-based layouts today, and I'll put it up online as well. But basically, this is our method for how we lay out our websites right now. Okay, so all the stuff that you guys have on your website or on your designs where you want things to sit side by side, right? And currently everything is sitting top to bottom like in a column. And we want to start moving things so they can sit next to each other and get a little bit more complex layout. We are going to start by applying floats, okay? So the first thing is that we should know a little bit about what float-based layouts kind of entail, okay? So it entails a lot, and they're not super intuitive. They're actually extremely confusing to work with, but you will be able to make a layout happen for yourself with it. So some of the things that you should know about floats. One is that floats allow these blocks, these chunks of things that normally stack on top of each other, to sit side by side, okay? So you can make your header and your main sit side by side using floats. You can make your aside come up and sit next to the main using your floats. You can make your images and your galleries sit next to each other using floats. You can float blocks to the right or to the left of their parent container. So imagine that like this right here, the window that we're looking at of our screen, was our container, okay? So like the div with the ID of container. So that is like our parent, right? And if I wanted to float something to the right and it was inside of the container, so let's say I wanted to float my aside to the right-hand side and it was in the container. When I float it to the right, it comes over here and it goes as far as it can until it hits the edge of its parent, whichever direction it's floated. Okay, so we can only float to the right or we can float to the left, and the element will go and push as far as it can up against the side until it reaches its parent. Okay, then it can't go beyond that. That's kind of like its boundary, right? But it's any element that they're in, whatever box, whatever parent they're in. So the parent could be the footer, the parent could be a div, the parent could be the nav, the parent could be in main, right? Or it could be a sub-element within those. We're going to see a bunch of examples. So floating affects all of the elements that come after the floated content, and it doesn't affect anything in the code that came before the floated element, right? So for example, if my layout was like, or if my content was like, header, and then main, and then aside, and then footer, okay? And let's say I floated main to the left-hand side, who's going to be affected by this? Everybody below, okay? Main's going to be affected, with aside being the next most heavily impacted, and we would normally only float main to the left so that we could get main and aside to sit side by side. There's no other real reason. But the footer is still going to be affected by this, okay? The footer is still going to have fallout from this. And so we're going to have to deal with the fallout from everybody that comes after the floated element in here, okay? You can ask questions to George, okay? George is from Monday, Wednesday. Came in today because I wasn't there yesterday. Okay, so, and the only person the only element that's not going to get dealt with in here, doesn't get affected, is going to be header. And that's because in the code it came before the floated elements, so they don't get affected by this. And then to stop the floating effect and to stop that fallout that happens, we have to use something called a clear fix. And a clear fix is a way for us to just kind of say it stops here, or go back to acting like normal. That's what we use this thing called a clear fix call. And we'll look at those all today. Okay, so here's our first example in here, is kind of like the sort of big layout, like the main layout. We're not talking about, with inside of main or inside of the header right now, but just kind of these main layout elements that we end up using. So in this instance right here, what we're trying to pay attention to is both, oh, I found this cool thing in here when I was perusing around people's drawers. Let's see if I can find it again. Is it this? It was this, but it doesn't work. It works for short people, like me. Let me see. Maybe it works now. Does it work now? No.
Oh, I saw it beep.
Oh, there it is. Oh, that's weak. I can't do that. Okay. So what we're paying attention to then with this one is the source code. Okay, so the order in which the elements are listed here inside of the code. And then we're looking over here at the CSS as well. So let's talk about what's happening in here. So main and aside are sitting side by side. Okay? Inside of our code sample, main came first, right? So inside of our code right here, main came first. Now, because it came first in here, if we want main and aside to sit side by side, main is the one that needs to get out of the way, okay? Main is the one that needs to have the float applied. If aside had the float applied, main would not be affected. Why wouldn't main be affected if we floated aside?
Because it's above it.
Because it's above it in the code, right? So this is our last slide that we just talked about. The things that were above in the code, they don't get affected. So in order for these two things to sit side by side, it's got to be the first thing that shows up inside of our code. So in this instance, it's main, okay? So main moves to the right-hand side. So it goes to the edge of its parent, this outer box right here. And because we gave main a width of 760 pixels, and we're going to assume that our container is 960 pixels, okay, that's always going to be my assumption. So it leaves 200 extra pixels over here as a gap. So when main's like, ooh, I'm not 960 anymore, now I'm 760, and I'm floated to the right-hand side, it gives up those extra 200 pixels that are on the left-hand side, and aside is like, uh-oh, I guess I gotta go get in there, and it scoots up, and it occupies all that space over here that's left over, that extra 200 pixels on the side, all right? So the aside has a margin on the right. So if you look at aside's roll over here, aside has a margin on the right, and it's equal to or greater than the width of this floated thing. So what's really happening in here right now is aside, right? It used to be main and then aside. Main said, now I'm narrower and I have floated to the right-hand side, so it's kind of pushing off to this direction. Main goes, oops, I gotta get in, and it weasels its way in here. And now this margin that's on the right-hand side, if you can think about it, it's kind of set up like a gate over here. And so the gate is pushing, it's going from this edge, okay, this is what margin right does, from the edge of the container, it's pushing 780 pixels off of that edge, which is gonna give a little 20 pixel space between these two, okay, because this one's 760 and that one is 780, so there's a little gap in there. And the reason for why we do that, why does aside need to have a margin on the right, is because we want them to always be in columns, okay? If aside does not get a column, if it does not get that margin, so it's saying I'm pushing away from that edge of the container, if it doesn't do that, then if they're ever unequal heights, aside is going to scoot underneath and try to occupy the space in here. Yes?
I have a question about, so I don't understand, so you're saying the whole box,
The outer box?
the entire box is 960
That's,
pixels?
yep,
So the whole container itself,
Yep.
right? So then how come it's 760 pixels to 780 if that's more than 600 and...
So they're actually not though. So this one right here, it doesn't see main anymore. It doesn't see it. It's kind of like main's become invisible to it, okay? And this is sort of what happens. We'll see more about this in the future, but when an element floats, all of the other elements around it stop seeing it there. It's kind of like it's become invisible, but it still takes up space, okay? So right now it's taking up 760 pixels of that 960 pixels, okay? So it's left over these 200 pixels right here. So aside comes up and scoots in, and it wants to come in here and like fill this out, but it wants to span the whole width, because that's what block elements do. They always want to like be the whole width, okay? It can't really be the whole width because main is still there, but it kind of like only half knows that. So what happens with this is like, if you could imagine like it's pushing over here all the way across, and it only sees the edge of the container. It doesn't really see main there. So we're putting up the sort of superficial margin on this side right here of 780 pixels, because if main, so in this example right here's our header. Let's say that main didn't have a lot of content in it and it got like really short, right? It had like a headline and then it had a couple of paragraphs, but that was it. That's how we determine how tall that element is. So when we stop having stuff inside of main, it stops growing vertically. But let's say that the aside over here is a big long list of links that are going to like other pages or going to other websites or whatever. And it gets really long, and eventually it gets longer than main is, vertically speaking. If we didn't have this thing saying stay away from that edge over there, you have to stay 780 pixels away from that edge over there, right? If we didn't do that, then once a side got taller than main, it would do this. It would want to flow in and take this space back up, because remember, it wants to spread out, okay? It's not been floated, it's just been affected by the flow. So if it gets the opportunity, it's like, la 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 la. So it can't do that if we say, you're not allowed to go over here. You can't, you have to keep 780 or pixels off that edge. Okay?
So that happens with all of the other boxes as well, right?
Well, the other boxes, none of them have a flow or a margin, because this one is like, I'm not really affected. It's going to be staying down here like as a big, long, wide box. Mainly because we will have applied a rule to it that you don't see up here, because it's kind of more than what we would talk about right now. But yeah, does that kind of give a little bit? Okay, yeah.
How would you do the math on that? Like to know that margin right should be 780?
So it just has to be equal to or greater than
okay.
the width of this one.
So you could have wrote 760.
I could have written 760, and then they
Okay.
would touch edges. So if I wanted them, like if their background colors were the same, right? Let's say the whole thing is white, and we don't probably need to have that space there, as long as there's other space built in so that the content of main and the content of aside aren't touching each other.
So you wanted like 20 pixels.
I gave a 20 pixel gutter, so we would think of that as being kind of like a gutter between two columns, right? So by adding that extra space in there, I'm just making sure that they each have a little bit of a buffer zone in there so that they're not going to be like touching each other.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah.
When we do div ID as a container, how does making a div ID as an outer different? Is that gonna
As a what?
the outer?
Oh, I just called it outer. You want to know why? It's because when I was trying to make this stuff fit on a slide container, it was too long. Outer and container and wrapper and
So that
parent, or you could call it anything you want.
But it would be like we would still have container in something else? Or
No,
just container?
because remember, we get to pick our names. I just call it container always, which is
okay.
why you guys call it container.
Right.
But I could have started this semester saying I call it wrapper,
Okay.
and then you would have all been calling it wrapper. Or I could have said I call it outer, and you guys would have all started calling it outer, right? But we can change it at any time. There's no real thing called the container.
So there's no HTML rule,
Nope.
law?
Nope, there's nothing like that. It's just convention. So a lot of people say outer, a lot of people say wrapper. There's a lot of different ways to call it. And in this case, right, or container, and in this case I put outer because I was trying to make them sit before, and I was like, you're too long. I have to make you smaller. So that's why I went with outer. Yep.
Okay.
Other questions about this slide? Okay. All right, so here's another example in here. So this is another thing. I don't know if anybody has something that looks like this in your own design. If you're thinking about doing something like this where you have an image that's maybe, or images that are kind of embedded inside of your, body content, and you want the text to kind of flow around them. So they're not in discrete columns, right? It's not image and then text over here, and they never commingle with each other. It's like image, and then the text flows around, and then you might have an image where the text, flows around. So that would be like this example. And this one is pretty simple because the image comes first. Remember, it's the image or the thing that comes first that needs to be floated. So in this case, it would have been like image right here, and then all the text below it, right? That's how it would have looked normally. Now once we take the image and we float it to the left-hand side, the text goes, ooh, I got a lot of space up here. I should come up here and flow into this area. So the text comes up, and truthfully, the text is like, it's coming up and it wants to go over here. But it won't go there because there's a block, right? So it won't go over there, but that's where it wants to go. But it's kind of being blocked by this image that's in there. Somebody had this happen to them the other day, and I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was Alex, but I can't remember. Somebody had it where we were trying to move something side by side, and we couldn't get it to go over there. Because, yeah, it was Alex, because of that margin on the bottom of your headline. We had to take the margin off the bottom so it could move over. But remember, it was like, I'm trying, and then it got stuck. And sometimes it gets stuck by things that are have been floated. Okay, so in this one, the image was just floating to the left. And the image has been given a margin here, so outside of its border, right? And down here, outside of its border to push the text away. If it didn't do that, the text could be touching the edge of the image, and that would be unattractive, right? It's just too crowded. So we're making sure we put in a little bit of that margin space outside of the image. I didn't have to put a margin on this side, and if I would have, then the edge of the text and the edge of the image wouldn't have been aligned, right? And that would cause some tension there. So it's nicer for them all to be lined up over here on the right-hand side, but over here on the bottom and on the right, we needed some space. I also didn't want to put any on the top, or it would have pushed the image down, and that also would have created kind of awkward alignment on the top of that. Okay, so here's another one. This is probably kind of like, anybody have an example like this inside of their website where you have boxes of things putting together? So this is like your slide, right? So this is kind of like more complicated because we have boxes within boxes. So in this case, we have groups. And I'm referring to the, like, this is a group, and this is a group, and this is a group, and this is a group, okay? And they're a group, they're all connected as divs in here. Each one of those groups is being created because of the div, and you can see that there are only 3 divs in my example, but just fill in the blanks because I ran out of space. For the last one, it's exactly the same as all the others. So I have these boxes here, and each one of them, they all share the same class, right? So they're sharing the same class name, so they can all be styled the same way with just one rule, right? I don't need to make a rule that affects this one and separate rules that affect this one because I want them to do the same thing, right? So in here, we have the div groups share a class name, which is .image text, and they are all floating to the left. So the parent has a clearing rule applied to it so that it doesn't collapse when its children are set to float, which is what would otherwise happen. So what this means is that when we started this one off, right, we had these boxes like this. These would be the divs, and the image would be on the top, and then we have paragraphs, right? So the paragraph would have gone like this. And then the other one would be right below it, and here, same thing, an image, and then a paragraph. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to make them narrow, and we wanted to have them sit side by side. So we gave them all the same class name to the boxes, to the divs. And then when we floated them to the left, the first one goes, I got narrow, and I move to the left. The second one comes up, gets narrow, moves to the left. So it goes up, and it comes up here, and it goes to this edge until it hits this one, it stops, right? The third one comes up, moves over, bumps up against this one, and then gets stuck there. And the fourth one comes up and fits perfectly inside of that slot, as long as your math is correct, okay? Sometimes our math is not correct. And then what happens is we have 1, 2, 3, and this one is like solo, hanging out, all by itself, on its own row, sad days, right? So this is the leftover down here, if our math isn't correct, which we'll also talk about today. So when those things float, okay, so in this case, the parent, this blue box right here, the only thing it has are these 4 divs inside of it. That's it. They don't have anything else. Remember how I said that when the stuff floats, it kind of becomes invisible a little bit? Like the other elements kind of don't see it. They sort of do, sort of don't. So what happens when you have all of the elements inside of this have become invisible, the parent doesn't think it needs to stretch vertically to hold anything because it doesn't see any of its children or their height. And so what's the height? The height is the image plus the text in here. So the image plus the text in here, they do have a height, but the parent box around them doesn't see that. So it shrinks its bottom up, right? It doesn't get very tall. And so it ends up looking like this. This is kind of what it will look like inside of your design. I call it dangling because it's kind of like a dangle, right? It's awkward. So this is what it would look like in here. Is like you would have these things hanging out, and this would be the whole parent. The parent would shrink up, and it would not come down like how we see it right now and go around the bottom, because it doesn't recognize these elements or anything inside of them anymore. And remember that the height is only controlled by the stuff that the parent sees, like whatever its content is, right? So it won't see it in there. So what we have to do is, in order to get the box to go all the way down to the bottom and collect all of its children, it needs to have a clear fix applied to it. And that's what we're doing up here. This is the clear fix, okay? And you'll get some of this, and you'll get this in your tutorial as well. But basically, this is the thing that's telling the parent to come down and expand vertically all the way to this area. And the reason why it's happening is because this little tiny weird rule right here is essentially inserting, after the last element, a tiny little fake invisible element. And that's being done through this content equals nothing. Okay, we could actually put something in there, like a word, and a word would show up. We could put an image in here, and an image would show up. So we could put content in here, and it would show up on the page. But we're putting nothing in there. That's why the quotations are empty, right? And then we're telling that nothing thing. See, it's all like a hack, so you just have to realize that there's nothing logical about it. But we're telling this little nothing to basically be clearing and sit like it's a block at the bottom of this parent. And so it doesn't even matter if you even understand it, but it works, and it will make the parent expand down and enclose the children. So even if you're like, I don't know what she talked about, that's fine. You just have to do it, okay? You don't have to understand it. You just have to write it, that's all. And so notice how we say pound parent in that rule. That thing could be main, colon, after. That thing could be footer, colon, after. Whichever thing has collapsed, whoever it is, anybody that's collapsed, put his name there and say after and put that stuff in. That's all you have to do. So your thing is like, oh my God, looks like that thing is collapsed. Go write a rule. Just write that rule, put its name in there, and then it'll be fixed, okay? Yeah.
So if that element, those elements, whatnot, are in, like, say, a section, that's what you would put as the ID instead of
You put the name of the section.
Okay.
Yeah, so instead of pound parent, you'd put, like, maybe the section is called, you know, pound contact us or something like that. Then it would be pound contact us. Okay. Yep. Or if it was the header, because you guys will float things in the header. I know a number of you want to float things in the header. Like you want a logo to sit next to your text, right? And then once you start floating things like that, your header is going to be like, I don't see you. And it's going to get really short. And if you want, you might not even notice it when you're doing it. If you're working with all white, like all the background colors are white, and you don't have any borders visible, you won't even necessarily notice if your container is collapsed because you won't see the color of it. It'll all still look white. But if you applied a border property to it, you wanted to make the border visible, you would see that the border was like up here instead of going down and around, right? Or if you gave it a background color for the thing, you see the background color like only exists as a little strip. You're gonna see that today when we do the tutorial, because when we do the tutorial, you'll see all these things collapse, and we'll apply the clear fix to make it expand back down. So then the image text things right here, these boxes, they're all floating to the left. They each have 200 pixels in here, right? And then they have a padding, which is on the inside. So that's like this little space in here, the padding. And then they have a border on them. And just for fun, because we have to do math today, let's do some math right now and just calculate how much space do each one of the, or do the sum total of all 4 of these take up in here? Okay, so let's go ahead and do it. So it looks like this, right? So we've got a bad pen. So it looks like this. So the box is 200 pixels wide. That's the content in here. We're going to be basing this on an older box model. You're going to look at a new one today. So It's 200, actually, you know what, I'm not gonna do it. Just kidding, I'm not gonna do it because we are gonna talk about a different way to do it today. And I was gonna do it using the old way. So let's wait till we get to the box model stuff and then we can talk about how we calculate the widths in here. Anybody else wanna ask any questions about this slide?
So you're saying that if you're gonna put the picture's gonna be at the top, not at the bottom, right?
In this example, the picture could be at the bottom, doesn't matter. Because the picture is not actually having, no rules are applied to the picture right now.
But like, does it know that it has to be in that box, or do we code it?
It would know that it's in the box because right here, we say the div opens and closes and inside of it is an image followed by a paragraph. But you could just as easily say, here's the box, right, which is one of these boxes, and you could easily say the paragraph comes first followed by the image. And in that case, the text would be on top and the image would be on the bottom. So that's called our source order in normal document flow, which is our next slide. Okay, so we've kind of like looked at, it's growing, yeah, the source order, it's like flowing, nice flow. So what's happening in here is like, we just looked at a bunch of examples of like when you might need to use the floating, right? Like kind of examples of when you would apply that. But some of the stuff that we need to know, so now we're like kind of backing up, is that there's something called the source order and the normal document flow. And the source order basically means like the order that you put your code in is the order that things are going to show up inside of your document. So if the image came first in your code, then it shows up higher, like above, right? And then the headline came second, so we see that next, and then the paragraph is next, right? So we just like know that already. We didn't need to call it a name, right? You just have, even if you never said it out loud to yourself, you kind of understood it from working that you put the things at the top of your code, they're going to be at the top of your page. The normal document flow just says that the order of the code is also going to be the visible order of your stuff on the page, right? It's saying this. The order of your code equals the visual order on your page. That's what it says. It also says that blocks stack on top of each other. Okay, that's part of normal document flow. Block elements stack on top of each other, okay, and they don't sit side by side. So when we start to work with floating, we're actually like, we are disrupting that. We're disrupting this sort of normal document flow. Because not now will anything, not, you know, is it absolutely true that just because you came first in the code, you're going to show up above anymore. Now you might show up side by side, right? And let's look at a weird example of this from earlier. This one. If you just saw this, and I said write the code for that, you might write header, and then aside, and then main, and then footer. Why? Because we're in the West, and in the West we read from the top to the bottom, right? And from the left to the right, like an exercise instructor right now. I gotta remember my rights and my lefts. So in here right now, we might think like, oh, well that, you know, because we read this direction, we might have thought that it would have been header, aside, then main, then footer. But we've disrupted this using our floats. Main actually came first, and we floated main to the right-hand side, and so aside came over here, but that kind of feels reversed to us a little bit, right? So what I'm saying with that other slide that we just moved from is that when we are messing around with floats, it's not necessarily true anymore that what we visually see coming first is actually first in the code. So in this example right here, what has happened? Who can articulate what's happening here? Well, you could read my document and also tell me, but the image came first, right? And where is it floating? To which direction?
To right.
To the right. And then what's next is a headline and paragraph, and they're like, ooh, I'm going to get up in that space. So as soon as the image goes to the right-hand side, the other two things come up and they occupy the space next to them, all right? As much room as they can occupy. Okay, so we talked about this one in one of our other examples. This was the one also with the aside and main, and like how do we create columns of content. So we also saw the other example where we had the image and then we had the text that flowed around it. And this is like in like contrast to that. If you want things to sit in columns, You don't want the flow to happen. So for example, sometimes people want to do things where they have an image and then they might have like, you know, a headline here, and then they might have an H2 here, and then they might have a couple of bullets, and then they might have a paragraph down here, and they don't ever want that stuff to come over into this side. You just want to keep it like in a pair. And so you're afraid that like, yeah, you might have only this much content now, but as you grow, it might start to wrap underneath that. That's what we're trying to do here, is create discrete columns. They never mix. So what's happening in this one right here is the image has been floated to the left, okay? But if this paragraph is going to stay here in the column, then it also needs to have a left margin, and it's basing this margin amount on the space between its edge and the left edge of its parent, okay? And in this case, it's gonna have to be equal to or greater than, right? If you want a little gutter in between, it has to be greater than the width of the image that was floated. So if this was 100 pixels, then this paragraph needs to have a margin on the left of at least 100 pixels, or it could be a little bit more if you want to build in a gutter space in there. Is anybody trying to do something like this in their layout? Okay, so then this would be your example, right, of what you would be working with. Okay, we have 2 box models to talk about in here today. Because the box models are how we calculate the widths of our stuff. And as you're probably noticing, the width of things becomes important now, because we have to calculate how wide things are to make sure that they can fit in the space that we have allowed in our layout. So our layout, the way that I refer to it, will always be 960 pixels wide. The container is always 960 pixels wide. So what we have to do in here is we have to think about like, well, okay, but I need 4 things to sit side by side. They have 960 pixels to sit in. How big can they be, right? So I'm sure many of you have examples of this in your own websites right now. I've seen them where things are sitting side by side. You have to figure out how big are they going to be? How much room are they allowed to take up? So we have 2 different ways to calculate these widths. And both of them refer to this thing called box sizing, which that's the CSS property called box sizing. But the concept is called the box model. So the box model, we have 2 modes. We have the default mode, which is what we're using right now, and that's called content box. That's, nobody set it, it's just the way, you know how we always have all these defaults that we kind of don't know about, but they're already there and affecting our stuff, like the size of your text already has a size, even though you didn't set it, right? There's already a font chosen, even though you didn't choose it, right? It's already serif type when you start. Those are kind of defaults. So our default model here is the content box. And you know how like we go in and we say, I want to make a rule for the container, and I want to give it a width of what? What have we been giving it?